we are now talking about Chapter 6 in your textbook, which looks at adaptations that occur with aerobic endurance training. And there again, we talk about chronic and acute adaptations. Acute adaptations are changes that occur with each bout of exercise, where chronic adaptations occur with long-term long-term training. So as we stick to a training program, what are the changes that occur, and they are maintained throughout our training regimen. And when we look at chronic adaptation, it usually, we see the changes usually at a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks of being involved in our regular training program. And we see the chronic adaptations, we'll see changes that occur at rest, at submaximal workloads, and then also at maximal workloads. Obviously, the adaptations depend on the type of training we do. If we do steady state running or we do interval training, how often we exercise, for how long a duration, how intensely, and then always our genetic makeup affects the adaptations that occur as well. And so if we were to look at acute changes that occur in the cardiovascular system, so every time we go out for a run or ride a bike, our heart rate increases when we start exercising. And that's in an effort to increase our cardiac output, to send more oxygen-rich blood to our working muscles so that we can produce energy oxidatively. The second thing that increases is our stroke volume, and we saw that in one of the previous chapters. As we have increased venous return, we have greater filling of that left ventricle. It stretches the muscle fibers, and then the Frank-Starling principle is activated, where it results in a stronger contraction of the left ventricle. And as a result of both our heart rate and our stroke volume increasing, we see an increase in our cardiac output. And the formula for calculating cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So if those two mechanisms increase, we're going to have an increased cardiac output. And cardiac output is the amount of blood that's pumped out in a minute and from the heart. And you can see why this is really important, because we're able to, if we're able to increase our cardiac output, we're able to deliver more oxygen-rich blood to the muscle, and then the muscle can use that oxygen to produce ATP for the working muscle. And so the greater our cardiac output, you would believe our greater exercise potential. We also have a decrease in our peripheral resistance, and that's the resistance that when our heart contracts and ejects blood out, we have a decreased resistance in the vascular bed, and that's because we also dilate the arteries to our working muscles, and so that when they're opened up or dilated, so more of that blood gets shunted to our working muscles, there's a decreased resistance that the heart has to push against. Our blood pressure does increase, our systolic increases, but our diastolic remains the same. Our systolic blood pressure increases just because we're pumping out more blood with each beat of the heart. So there's more volume being ejected into that vessel, into the artery, and it just puts more pressure on the artery wall. And so this is a normal response. It's not abnormal. We want to see that. When someone exercises aerobically and we see an increase in the systolic blood pressure, that tells us that the heart is capable of doing the work that's put on it. If someone was exercising and they dropped their systolic blood pressure, that's an indication that there's something going on many times at the level of the heart, that the heart can't handle the increased workload. And then our diastolic remains the same. We also have a decrease with exercise in our plasma volume, and that's just because more of that plasma is being, with a high increased pressure, it goes more into the interstitial spaces, spaces between cells. And as a result of that, we see our hematocrit, which is a percentage of our blood, how much of it is made up of red blood cells. If we decrease the amount of plasma, we're going to have proportionally more red blood cells. Our coronary arteries dilate, and so they enlarge. And the reason for that is your heart is beating harder, faster, and so it's demanding more oxygen. And so the arteries that lay on the surface of the heart, called the coronary arteries, dilate so that more oxygen rich blood gets sent to the myocardium or the heart muscle. And so, as a result of our heart rate and our blood pressure increasing, um, our rate pressure product, which is the indicator of oxygen demand of our heart muscle, that would increase because it's going to demand more oxygen as the heart rate increases and as the systolic blood pressure increases. And so this just shows, up in the upper left-hand corner, blood pressure. If we're pumping out more blood into that artery, more pressure is going to be exerted against the artery wall during systole. And then and below it, you'll see the coronary arteries, and they come off the aorta. So they are the first branches off the aorta, and they bring oxygen-rich blood to the surface of the heart. And then there's branches that branch, smaller branches that get to the kind of branch out and to get to all areas of the heart. And so these are the arteries that when somebody has a heart attack, they can be blocked and stop the blood flow or delivery of oxygen to areas of the heart muscle. And then up in the right-hand corner, this would just be a representation of how we see our the aorta arteries branch off our aorta, and then we have smaller branches, arterioles, and then we get to the level of the capillaries. And the capillaries are where we have oxygen exchange between the capillaries and the muscle cells. And this is one of the changes that occur when everything dilates. We send more blood, oxygen-rich blood, to the muscle, and the muscles extract more oxygen. And as far as respiratory changes that occur, we see an increase in our ventilation, so our uptake of oxygen, and that's going to increase because our frequency of breathing, our respiratory rate, we breathe faster and more rapidly, and then we also breathe deeper. That's our tidal volume. So that will result in the increased ability to fully saturate this increased volume of blood and deliver oxygen-rich blood to the working muscles. We have a measure called the RQ, or the respiratory quotient. And the respiratory quotient is just looking at the volume of CO2 produced versus divided by the volume of oxygen our body consumes. And respiratory quotient is when somebody does oxygen consumption studies where they actually measure oxygen and CO2 produced. They will measure the RQ or calculate the RQ because it tells you what is the primary mechanism for ATP production or energy production. And usually when people are down closer to 0.8, that is more reflective of that they're metabolizing, or they're into oxidative energy production. Whereas when the RQ gets closer to 1, they're more likely to be metabolizing carbohydrates or glycolysis. And the RQ is oftentimes used as an indicator to know when you've really done a true maximal test, because you can calculate the RQ, and it gives you, the closer you get to 1, you can determine that you're getting pretty close to the person doing a maximal stress test. And so the responses, metabolic responses that we see is we see an increase in our AVO2 difference when we exercise. And if you recall what AVO2 difference is, that's the oxygen content in the arterial blood um, before it gets to the muscle, and then comparing that to the oxygen content in the venous blood after it leaves the muscle. And we see a greater difference in this arterial and venous blood. And the reason for that is that when we exercise, we extract much more of the oxygen out of the arterial blood to fuel the increased needs of exercise, so we can produce more ATP. At rest, we don't have as great an AVO2 difference because we don't need all that oxygen in the muscle because we're not exercising those muscles. But once we start exercising, we need more oxygen for that oxidative energy production. And so that explains why we have that greater AVO2 difference. The other thing that occurs when we exercise aerobically, an acute response, is we increase our consumption of oxygen. We take in more oxygen and we use more oxygen. This is another repeat from another chapter, is we can calculate oxygen consumption by the cardiac output multiplied by the AVO2 difference. So as you can see, we're going to increase the amount of oxygen we consume is a reflection of the amount of oxygen that we send to the muscle and then the amount of oxygen that we extract. And that's reflective of the amount of oxygen that we consume or take up. And your body's ability to take in more oxygen and use oxygen is a reflection of that system's ability to not just to breathe it in, saturate your blood with oxygen, send that oxygenated blood to the working muscle muscle's ability to extract the oxygen and then use it for ATP production. So this greater oxygen uptake, an athlete or anyone exercising, an untrained subject, our ability to take in and use oxygen is a reflection of all those systems working together to meet the body's demands for exercise. So the more physically fit a person is, or those systems are more fit, they're going to have this ability for greater oxygen uptake, and they're going to be able to achieve higher levels of work. So as we start to exercise more vigorously, we produce more carbon dioxide as a byproduct. We have more lactate production, and if you recall, this lactate is not necessarily a bad thing because that can be used to help produce ATP. It can be used to make glucose more available. The problem with lactate is when we start to accumulate it, when we can't buffer it or we can't use it for ATP production. We have an increase of hydrogen ions, start to have a decrease in pH. And when we start moving out of our oxidative energy production and more into glycolysis or in our anaerobic energy production, that's when we're going to have this accumulation of the hydrogen ions, decreased pH, and that's going to result in muscle fatigue and the decreased ability to continue exercise. So if we were to look at some relationships, we see that as we work harder, our oxygen uptake increases because we need more oxygen to fuel exercise, but also our heart rate increases. And we would call this a linear increase, meaning that pretty much for every increase in oxygen uptake, we have an increase in heart rate. And so we have a nice straight line increase. And then we all eventually reach what we call a maximum heart rate, which is the fastest our heart can beat. And we also, if you look at the bottom graph, you see as exercise intensity increases, as we work harder, our VO2 consumption also increases. Okay.